Some people are hung up on some flubs President Biden had last night, but Donald Trump himself had an entire week of crazy, including the completely bonkers rally in Doral. Where do things stand at the end of this week?
Well, let's just say one thing very clearly. I am really want to emphasize that the Democratic Party is very united right now. They are very united around an important principle, and that is beating Donald Trump. There's some honest disagreement right now about the best way to do that, but everyone understands that is the goal that unites us. And frankly, this week is a good example of showing why that is so important. I mean, it's crazy town over there, whether it's electric boats or whether it's, showers or toilets or all the nonsense he talks about and his revenge and his lack of respect for the Constitution. We can go on and on about what a jerk this guy is. So I really think everybody just needs to take a deep breath. Respectfully, people can disagree about the best way to beat Donald Trump. And I will make a prediction, Stephanie. At the close of the Democratic convention, you will see an incredible unity around whoever is leading the ticket at that moment. And that decision will be made by one person and one person alone, Joe Biden.
That's a really interesting way to put it. But potentially what the Democratic Party is doing right now is ensuring that they have the best possible SWAT team to defend themselves, to defeat the biggest threat to democracy, Donald Trump. Where do you think things stand, Hayes?
I think that Claire is right that the party is united around this goal, but I think that the divisions over who is at the top of the ticket are deep and they're getting deeper. I think that what's been interesting since the debate, which, again, the Biden team wanted to hold it early precisely kind of for this reason, so that in case there was a situation where Biden underperformed, let's say, they would have time to make up the difference as opposed to it happening just a couple of weeks before people go to the polls. But I think that there was a moment with the debate where a lot of people who had told themselves, all right, look, Biden is the candidate. This is how it's going to be. He's very old, but he's still very capable. We're going to keep our mouths shut and just get through this until the election. I think that the debate really sort of shattered that illusion for a lot of people. And so the debate over how to beat Donald Trump is going to be front and center between now and the end of the convention. And it's why you have people looking at alternatives, why you have the Biden campaign polling on how well Kamala Harris does in a head-to-head with Trump instead of Biden. It's why you see this sort of division disarray that's happening right now. I think that Claire is right that by the time we end the convention, everything will be set in stone at that point. We are in this sort of interregnum period.
Damn well better be.
People are trying to figure out. People are trying to figure out what can happen, what levers can be pulled between now and the end of the DNC. But after that, ballots are going to be starting to be printed. Early voting is only like several weeks after that, and people are going to have to be on board by that point if beating Trump really is the goal.
Jemele, what do you think? Where are things in this race?
So let me just say, I just think it is a startling amount of spinelessness in the Democratic Party. I said this on social media, but I'll clean it up for this show. If Donald Trump would have urinated on himself on that stage, the Republicans would have called it the greatest presidential urination they've ever seen. And I am stunned at the level of discord that's in this party right now, because at the end of the day, this was a story that could have lasted a couple of days. And the Democrats, by various elected officials coming out and saying that they want to see a replacement with George Clooney's editorial, with all of this, you've extended the lifespan of what essentially I think would have been a non-story 30 days later. And now you've extended it, given it life, given it credibility. Because the reality is that Joe Biden has done more than enough, not for his own party to turn over. Certainly, I don't think that's everybody in the party, but allowing what should be an in-house conversation to get this public was completely egregious. And I hate to say it, but what the politicians are saying, what the donors are saying, does not match what the people are saying. Most of the people, I think, practically know, yes, Joe Biden is old. We been knew that, okay? We knew that 3 years ago. We knew what age he was going to be already. And I think right now, all they're doing is continually sapping the energy from the voters who want to see Donald Trump defeated by continuing a story that, frankly, should never have been given this much life in the first place.
Claire, what do you think about Jemel's thoughts?
Well, listen, I got to tell you, the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, there are many differences. And Jemele and I would agree about those differences in terms of our values and how we see a way forward in this country, and things about opportunity and equality and all kinds of issues, economic issues. But one difference is our party has a tendency to fight in public. We don't gaslight the country and try to pretend that Donald Trump isn't a felon and that Donald Trump hasn't been found to be responsible for sexual assault on a woman and fined hundreds of millions of dollars for cheating on everything from charities to his taxes. And we don't gaslight the country. The country saw something they were concerned about in the debate. And the majority of the country still expresses concern about the aging process. That's a fact. The fact that Democrats are talking about it openly, I got to tell you, in some ways, I think it's healthy because the issue is baked in. And now Biden has an opportunity to show the country he can do this. I thought he did a great job in the press conference last night. And ultimately, he can heal all these wounds by how he handles this. If he's the nominee coming out of the convention, he will heal it by uniting us and saying everything is now about defeating Donald Trump. If he were to decide to step aside, he can heal it by saying, hey, I get it. I said I would hand the torch, and I'm handing it to an incredibly capable vice president. So I'm not as worried about this as everyone else is, because I do think we will come together like Democrats usually do in order to defeat a guy that is the most danger to our country that we've seen probably in my lifetime.
Joyce, it's a huge understatement to say these two parties are different. We thought that last night our reporting was going to be about Donald Trump's sentencing in the hush money case, because it was all supposed to be yesterday, but now that's been pushed to September 18th. Instead, it was the current president trying to prove himself to doubters in his own party, a stunning turn. What do you think about where we are right now?
You know, to the point that Claire is making, Democrats are the party of the big tent. And something that I think presents the contrast between the two parties is the fact that we are seeing this debate. Democrats don't enforce a dogma upon people that belong to the party. You don't get expelled from the party like Liz Cheney was expelled from the Republicans because you don't have a total agreement on the leadership of the party. We don't have a cult of personality, a Donald Trump in the Democratic Party. We do have people like me, I'll be clear about my bias, who honor Joe Biden's service and believe his experience is something that we should not set aside just because he's getting a little bit older. I mean, that's a cultural issue that we have in America, where we go after the bright, shiny thing and sometimes don't value people as they age. But I think his experience is important. Other Democrats see other things in other candidates that they like, and we are free to have those conversations, even when they're public and they're very messy. I think that makes us strong, particularly in contrast to a Republican Party where what we see is dogma and worship of a leader who the New York Times and the LA Times both came out today and called completely unfit to lead the country. That's the stark difference between these two parties, one that values democracy and the other that doesn't.
Claire, what's your take on this new reporting that there are donors who have paused $90 million in donations? Paused, not pulled. I want to understand how big of a deal you think this is, what it could mean for down ballot races.
Oh, I think it probably helps Joe Biden. Frankly, he's going to have an outpouring of grassroots financial support because of it. I think the very, very wealthy people think they're way more important than they actually are in politics today, because there has been there's a lot of horrible things about the internet as it relates to politics. We don't have fact checking, misinformation flourishes, but it has allowed real money to flow to candidates from folks in the amount of $10, $20, $30. I'm not worried about Joe Biden having enough money. And frankly, the billionaires wanting to cut him off, I think that probably helps his narrative. So I don't think that's a big problem for him. I think the bigger problem is the pressure he's under to perform and how he handles that in the coming weeks before the convention, and then how he handles the decision he has to make at that point in time. And by the way, the other weird thing about this is in an age where none of us trust polling, it's turned out that maybe the polling in the next month may determine the course of this country. And that is a very scary thing as far as I'm concerned. Give me those low donors online. And frankly, I don't like anybody relying on polling at this juncture.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.